ongoing moral failure. To avoid continued moral failures, we must openly acknowledge our sin. Here's Gene.
Now, in each of these principles, there's usually a key word or phrase. In each one of these principles, there's usually a key word or phrase. And here the word is acknowledge. Acknowledge. And this is something that David did not do. He did not acknowledge his sin. Now, in his heart, he knew he had sinned. He knew he was violating the will of God. And after he had sinned, he knew what he had done. And that's why he developed a plan to hide his sin. And the plan evolved, and it's diabolical. It's evil. When he started out, it was a simple idea that he thought would work, but it didn't work, and it just got worse and worse. You see, after Bathsheba reported through others that she was pregnant, he had a problem. And what is he going to do with this problem? And he knew that he had a problem, and he knew that he had sinned, and he knew that he violated the will of God. So, the first thing he did, well, he said, I'm going to send for Uriah. And so we read in 11:6 of 2 Samuel, David sent orders to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent Uriah to David. Now, when Uriah arrived on the scene, you can imagine how Uriah felt. Here, he's in the presence of the king of Israel. And so, David said, have a seat, Uriah. How are things going? How are you doing personally? You deserve a break. Why don't you go home? Why don't you spend an evening with your wife? And, of course, David just had planned the fact that this man would certainly do that. It would be normal, but to me, the heartbreaking thing about this is that Uriah had a much purer heart than David because he wouldn't go home. He said, I can't go home and enjoy what God has given me with my wife when my other brothers are out there on the battlefield. So he went and slept with the servants. I mean, that's an incredible attitude on the part of this man, Uriah. Well, it didn't work. So, David called for him and questioned him. We read about that in verse 10 of chapter 11. When it was reported to David, Uriah didn't go home. David, by the way, must have been flabbergasted. He couldn't believe it. I'm sure it convicted him to a certain extent, but he just went on and he questioned Uriah. Here's the question. Haven't you just come from a journey? Why didn't you go to your home? Are you crazy? I mean, I'm the king. I'm giving you the authority. And he said, King, how could I go home when others are out there giving their lives for you and this kingdom? And so he wouldn't go home. So you can just see this plan emerging in David's life because the next thing he does, he said, if the guy will not make a decision based on a sound mind, I'm going to get him drunk. This is King David. This is a man after God's heart. And that's the amazing thing, isn't it? How the mighty can fall. And so we read, David invited Uriah to eat, drink with him. And David got him drunk. Purposely got him drunk. And he, that is Uriah, went out in the evening to lie down on his cot with his master's servants, but he didn't go home. In other words, David could not bring him to a state of inebriation where he would make a decision and stumble home to his wife. That's how much conviction, by the way, Uriah had in his heart in terms of loyalty, even to the king, and that's what makes this such a sad story. Well, what's David going to do? Man, he's going downhill. Downhill. Nothing's working. So he arranges Uriah's death. The next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, sent it with Uriah. And in the letter he wrote, put Uriah at the front of the fiercest fighting, and then withdraw for him so that he is struck down and dies. And obviously that's exactly what happened. Not only had he committed adultery, but now he's committed murder to cover his sin. Well, he got the report, and then, of course, Bathsheba got the report, and she grieved. And in 2 Samuel chapter 11, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah had died, and she probably didn't know why or how it happened, she mourned for him. And when the time of mourning ended, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. You know, there's a certain element of nobility here and graciousness on David's part to now take her into his home because he's created the problem. But the other factor here is that David is still trying to cover his sin because in the eyes of the children of Israel, he would be a noble man to take her as his wife as the king and add him to his harem. Wouldn't he look good in this whole situation? So even in taking Bathsheba to be his wife, he's covering his sin. We read, however, the Lord considered what David had done to be evil. And the word evil is a very strong word. It was evil in the sight of God. Now, isn't that an incredible process? You see, he did not acknowledge his sin, and because he didn't acknowledge his sin, he went down and down and down from one sin to another until he engaged in this horrible act of taking a man's life. Now, in principle, you see, the same thing can happen, I think, to any Christian who sins and then justifies that sin and goes into a state of denial. And I think at some point along the way, David went into a state of denial and was hiding from himself. Not only deceiving others, but deceiving himself. And that's a lethal combination. And the Apostle John speaks about this in 1 John, verses 8 to 10. If we say we have no sin, we're deceiving ourselves. David was saying in his heart, I haven't sinned. He knew he had, but he was telling himself he hadn't. Evidently, he was deceiving himself. And the truth is not in us, John said. The truth certainly wasn't in David. On the other hand, if we confess our sins, acknowledge our sins, he is faithful and righteous to forgive us our sins, to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. David didn't do that. And then John said, if we say we don't have any sin, we make him a liar and his word is not in us. So what happened to David here happened just as John here says it can happen, self-deception. And this happens to mankind generally, but it can also happen to Christians. And we have to be very careful, because here's a man after God's heart who engaged in this horrible, deteriorating process. So the reflection and response question is, why are most of us tempted to cover our sinful actions even though we know we have violated God's laws? That's a rather penetrating question, isn't it? I think there are several answers that grow out of the life of David and the life of everything, other things we see. For example, our pride. You know, David is a proud man, and he's also embarrassed. As he thinks about what he's done, this is going to be known throughout Israel, and he's got to cover it. And so embarrassment caused him to try to cover his sinful actions. He saw the complex results of that sin, particularly in his act of immorality, because immorality really creates some very complex situations. I know a situation where a Christian man, committed adultery with a Christian woman who was the wife of his best friend. And the woman was the best friend of this man's wife. In other words, they were best friends. And he took advantage of this woman, although she cooperated in the process, and then he was found out. They have children on both sides. What are they going to do? Because the husband of the woman he took advantage of doesn't know what happened. How are they going to solve that issue? Well, one of the first things the man tries to do is hide his sin. He don't want to even talk about it. He wants to look the other way. God will forgive us and move on. But what about this woman and all of her guilt? What about her husband who doesn't know about this? And what about the children? What's going to happen when they find out? That's complexity. That's just a minor complexity compared with what David faced. But the fact is, it doesn't matter how small it is compared with what David did. Same dynamics. Pride, trying to cover, arrogance. All of us are aware of a president of the United States who committed immorality and looked right straight in the camera and said, "I did not have sex with that woman. I want you to hear me. I did not have sex with that woman." And later, he admitted he had. And the reason he admitted he had, basically, is because there was very hard evidence that he had, and he couldn't deny it. And then he said, "I lied." The whole world knew about that. And the whole world saw him lie, basically in our day of communication. You talk about embarrassment. You see, the more power you have, the more embarrassed you can become. The more well-known you are, the more the embarrassment hits. And the fact is, David was the king of Israel. And that certainly motivated him to try to cover his sin. So, the principle is, to avoid continued moral failures, we must openly acknowledge our sin.